Stream before. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jason Edwards. I'm a professor in the History of Art department, and it's my sincere pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the King's Manor on behalf of History of Art and Archaeology departments who are joint hosting this lecture. How does one introduce Professor Tim Ingold from the University of Aberdeen? As an extraordinarily creative, methodologically and historiographically significant professor of social anthropology, as a masterful interdisciplinary scholar who ranges not only across the intersection of what he calls the 4 A's, archaeology, art history, anthropology, and architectural history, but also across at least 3 more A's that are equally close to my heart: animals, autobiography, and the Arctic. Or as the author of The Perception of the Environment, Essays on Livelihood, Dwelling, and Skill, the book which has done more, in my opinion, to enable us to break free from the culture-nature binary than any other theoretical text, a text that is perceptually world-changing. And then there's Tim's book on lines, another literally astonishing book, which transformed the way I at least came to understand not only drawing and engraving, but walking and being in the world. And I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room or on the planet who feels that way. I don't want to waste another second of anyone's time, though, talking when we could all be listening to Tim speaking and thinking. Tim's talk today is entitled Reach for the Stars, Light, Vision, and the Atmospheric. Please join me in welcoming Tim Ingold.
Wow, well, anyway, thank you very much. So this talk is called, something I wrote last summer, is called Reach for the Stars, Light, Vision, and the Atmosphere. So, yeah, I want to begin with the simplest of questions. What is the sky? What do we mean when we say we see the sky rather than say the land, the ocean, or trees, or houses, or people? Can you draw the sky? Or can you paint it? Why do the stars seem so remote and so close at the same time? What is a sunbeam? Well, like all simple questions, these two turn out to be devilishly hard to answer. And so in attempting this next to impossible feat, I'm going to set in play a cast of just 2 characters, both of whom have hugely influenced my own thinking. One is the psychologist James Gibson, the other the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty. On balance, I shall be rather critical of Gibson and rather accepting of Merleau-Ponty, but this shouldn't be taken as a measure of the worth of their respective contributions. The reason why I have so much admiration for Gibson, despite my criticisms, is that he not only sought to answer, but also dared to ask such simple questions as the ones I just posed. He wanted to know how we perceive the world we naturally inhabit, rather than the artificial world of the research laboratory. A world, as he put it, comprised of the earth and the sky, with objects on the earth and in the sky, of mountains and clouds, fires and sunsets, pebbles and stars. Merleau-Ponty, by contrast, wondered how there could be a world with things to perceive in the first place. He wanted to know how the things become things and how the world becomes world. And in character and style, these two, the psychologist and the philosopher, could hardly have been more different. The one crisp, precise, and to the point, the other airy and obscure. Indeed, their respective characters bear an uncanny resemblance to that of which they speak. On the one hand, rays of light that go straight to a focus. On the other hand, the diffuse and percolating atmosphere. Gibson's words pierce the void. With Merleau-Ponty, you have to wait for them to sink in. So the first strike goes to Gibson. Of all the possible things that can be seen, is light one of them? So asks Gibson in the course of setting out his ecological approach to visual perception. And his answer is resoundingly in the negative. No, you can't see light. Light, he says, is the one thing we cannot possibly see. Now, it's an answer that at first seems perverse, because surely we can't see without light. In pitch darkness, we see nothing. But nor do we see anything in a thick fog, even in broad daylight. And this is because the radiant light coming from the sun is so scattered and diffused by vapor droplets in the air that any light reaching the eyes has already been effectively scrambled. It retains no structure and no pattern. On a clear day, by contrast, we might suppose that light reflected from the surfaces of environmental objects and features reaches an eye so placed as to receive it without further distortion. And to the forms and textures of these objects and features in the world, there correspond a nested series of angles at the eye. So the outline of a thing such as a tree subtends a larger angle within which are nested the numerous and much smaller angles subtended by the occluding edges of leaves and branches insofar as they can be made out. And this set of solid angles comprises what Gibson called the ambient optic array. Now, of course, the structure of this array is particular to a certain point of observation. And a single point perspective alone will not suffice to inform the viewer of the shapes or forms of environmental features in the round. But we normally see things not from fixed points, but while moving among them along a path of observation. As we move, the perspective structure undergoes continuous modulation, and underlying this modulation are certain invariants. And it was Gibson's contention that these invariants, which emerge from the flow of ever-changing perspective structure along a path, fully specify the shapes, forms, and textures of the things we see. Now, the critical point here is that visual perception is about the extraction of information from the structure in the light and its modulations. It's not about the way light itself stimulates the eye or triggers its photoreceptors. The alternative view, which is long ascendant in the psychology of perception, is that, strictly speaking, light is all that we see. Nothing else enters the eye. It's thus left to the mind to conjure internal images of what might be out there, to contribute conceptual form to the raw material of sensory stimulation. We have, according to classical optics, no direct access to the world. All visual perception is necessarily indirect. So if in Gibson's ecological approach you see the world but not light, in classical optics you see light but not the world. Now, I don't have any wish to defend this latter position because, in my view, it has been amply discredited. What I want to do is rather bring out a certain limitation shared by both sides in the understanding of light itself. On the one side, if to see means to register sensations triggered by the stimulation of retinal photoreceptors, then light is the energetic impulse that causes these receptors to fire. On the other side, if to see means to extract invariant information from an ever-varying optic array, then, as Gibson puts it, all we ever see is the environment or facts about the environment, never photons or waves or radiant energy. And that statement kind of gives the game away, for it reveals that Gibson is thinking of light in just the same sense as in classical optics. It is the physical cause of which retinal stimulation is the effect. And although it is from the workings of the eye in vision that the science of optics takes its name, light, in this sense, has no need of eyes to exist. It needs eyes only to establish its relevance. The existence of light, for Gibson, is a physical datum. Its relevance is an ecological one. Well, is there really no more to light than this? Nowhere are the limitations of a purely physicalist understanding more clearly revealed than in Gibson's attempts to demonstrate that light, far from being only what we see, is what we never see. Imagine yourself out on a dark night. Up above, stars twinkle in a cloudless sky, while at ground level, electric lamps shine through the windows of nearby houses. You see starlight and lamplight, or so you say. Gibson, however, insists that you do not. And I quote, "A single point of light in an otherwise dark field is not light. It specifies either a very distant source of light or a very small source, a luminous object." Well, how can light not be light? To be sure, the stars are very distant and the lamps are very small. We know that because of what astronomers have told us about stars and because everyday life has taught us about lamps. We know too that stars don't land on the ground and that houses don't take off into the sky. And for all these reasons, we're unlikely to confuse lamps with stars. But we might be forgiven for confusing both lamps and stars with light. In the world, according to Gibson, it transpires, the stars you witness in the heavens are but specks, specified by the light you do not see. And the lamps you see in the houses are likewise mere bulbs which indicate, among other things, that people are at home to switch them on. In this world, stars hang in the sky but don't shine. Lamps hang from ceilings but don't glow. The light is like a messenger that delivers stars and lamps to the doors of your perception, but magically vanishes at the moment you let them in. Well, as you ponder these thoughts, the moon rises over the horizon. Its silvery light casts faint shadows, revealing the contours of a landscape. But if you think you see the moonlight, says Gibson, you would be mistaken. Along with the forms of the landscape, he claims the moon is an object specified by the light and not in itself a show of luminosity. Observed closely, or perhaps through a telescope, you observe that the moon's surface is puckered by craters and other features whose forms are specified by angles in the optical array, nested within the angle subtended by the outline of the moon itself. Now, the astronomer will reassure us that, of course, the moon does not really emit light, and that what we call moonlight is actually the light of the sun reflected from its mottled surface. So perhaps Gibson is right after all. The moon is given to us by light, but is not light. But now the new day dawns and the sun rises, and as it does so, the stars vanish, the moon fades, the landscape that had once appeared as silvery shadows stands out as a polychrome manifold of surfaces, while up above is that great mystery we call the sky, appearing to us as a sea of translucent colour, shades of blue more intense towards the zenith, flecked with patches of white and grey that we call clouds. It seems that we are bathed in light, and yet Gibson still holds out. He continues to insist against the odds that we see objects specified by the light, not light as such. What goes for the moon, he contends, goes for the sun as well. It is delivered to us by its light, as a round object suspended in the sky, but it doesn't shine. So how come that if we attempt to look at it, or if we look at a glossy surface that reflects it, we are dazzled and even blinded by its brilliance? Are these not sensations of light as such? Gibson asks, and then promptly answers his own question in the negative. What we perceive is a state akin to pain, he says, arising from excessive stimulation. This is a fact about the body, not about the world. We perceive the pain and not the light. Strangest of all is Gibson's conclusion with regard to the sky, and once again he poses his own question. What about a luminous field, such as the sky? Only to respond with this most enigmatic of answers. To me, it seems that I see the sky, not luminosity as such. The sky is luminous, but to perceive the sky is not to perceive its luminosity. So what we might wonder is left of the sky once its luminosity has been subtracted. If light delivers the sky to our perception but then vanishes, well, doesn't the sky vanish with it? Are we not left on a cloudless day with precisely nothing, mere emptiness, save for the ghost of a sun that doesn't shine, turning shimmering day into starless night? And it's worth tracing the steps that lead Gibson inexorably to this perplexing result. The first step is to distinguish, as Gibson does, between radiation and illumination. Radiation is emitted from a source, illumination lights up the world. Radiation, principally from the sun, becomes illumination by being scattered in all directions, by refraction through particles in the atmosphere, and reflection from the mottled and textured surfaces of the earth. Step 2. Since the scatter is omnidirectional, for any selected point in the medium, that is the air, the ambient light converging upon it would come from all quarters. Third, to the extent that this ambient light is structured and not scrambled, it contains information that specifies features of the environment. But by the same token, fourth, unstructured ambient light specifies nothing. So what we perceive is emptiness. On lifting one's gaze from the landscape across the line of the horizon to the clear blue of the sky, the structured ambient light that specifies the opaque surfaces and textures of the landscape from which it is reflected, therefore gives way to the unstructured ambient light that permeates the sky, leading to the perception of a translucent void, interrupted only by more textured regions that indicate clouds. The ambient light of the sky, Gibson concludes, is no different from ambient darkness. Since it specifies nothing, there is nothing to be perceived. So the illuminated sky, like black night, is emptiness itself. Well, picture yourself once more on a starry night, perhaps the one famously painted in this picture. It will be familiar to you all, I'm sure, by Vincent van Gogh. The painting appeals to us precisely because it both resonates with our experience of what it feels like to be under the stars and affords us the means to dwell on it, perhaps to discover depths in this experience of which we might otherwise remain unaware. And two things are immediately apparent. First, the night sky is not homogeneous, nor is it empty, save for stars. It swirls with currents that resonate to the contours of the landscape, which we can dimly make out in the light of the crescent moon up at the top right. And secondly, the stars themselves are not inert specks in the firmament. On the contrary, they pulse. That's to say, their light is experienced not merely as a messenger, not merely as a vector of projection that yields them up as objects of our awareness. Rather, we feel it from within as an affect. Immersed in the swirling expanse, it's as though our minds and bodies were swept up in the flow, even as we remain rooted to one spot. So Van Gogh is not just painting stars. He is a starstruck painter. He sees and paints with their light. This is why the stars can be at once infinitely distant and yet touch the soul. It's not that vision puts the stars within reach so we might snatch them from the sky like apples from a tree, nor do we throw out a line to rope them in. But as Merleau-Ponty puts it, vision is the means given me for being absent from myself. To stand in place and open one's eyes upon the night sky is not to extend one's being along a continuum from near at hand to far away, but to find it split between two poles, one emplaced with the body, the other at large in the heavens, mingling with the stars and flitting like an agile spirit from one to another as the focus of attention shifts. And yet these two poles are really one, for at the termination of their fission, continues Merleau-Ponty, I come back to myself. We discover, perhaps to our astonishment, that the twinkling stars are our own eyes, that we don't just see them, but see with them. Because what Van Gogh paints is not the panorama of the sky in its totality, as it might perhaps be exhibited in a planetarium. His painting makes no claim to represent what he sees. It rather enacts in line and color the birth of his vision, which as it opens up upon the cosmos, seems to explode like a shower of fireworks. Wherever sensing meets the sensible, as Merleau-Ponty writes, or wherever our attention is let loose into the world, there is ignited a kind of spark. So the night sky glitters with 1,000 such sparks which burn for as long as they glow in our own eyes. Some burn bright, others fade, and in the painting you can actually follow the unfolding of the painter's attention as it wanders from star to star. A moment ago, it was with the stars near the top of the canvas, but now it's lowered to one nearer the horizon, which at this instant appears incandescent. That's the one with the white, lots of white around it. So this light, glowing white in the picture, is not the radiant energy of the physical universe, whether conceived as waves or photons, nor is it some disturbance or agitation of a consciousness imprisoned in that cavernous endocranial space behind the eyeballs. It doesn't travel in straight lines that connect a point source with a receptor. It's no more emitted from a source than it enters the eye. Rather, like a spark, it bursts from the fusion of the two poles of vision, respectively corporeal and celestial, in directions orthogonal to the line of their connection. So you have a star here, an eye here. The light is not going from one to the other, it's going like this, in this direction. So every star is not so much a hub from which shafts of light fan out in all directions, as a pivot around and between which and other stars the light seems to swirl in concert with our swiveling eyes. And this swirling corresponds with the temporal movement of our attentiveness. So long as attention is focused on a particular star, the light revolves tightly around it. But as attention wanders, so does the light. And here and there, the star sparks have already faded, leaving only flaccid and decaying swirls. And that is exactly how Van Gogh has painted them. So, as an affectation of being, light is the outcome of a fission-fusion reaction that unites us with the cosmos in the very moment that it divides us from ourselves. Of course, there could be no experience of light without the incidence of radiant energy, or without the excitation of photoreceptors in the retina, but as a quality of affect, of what it feels like to inhabit an illuminated world, light is reducible to neither of these. And nevertheless, this experience is entirely real. We can't afford to dismiss it as an illusion, any more than we can write off the history of painting as an aberration caused by the overstimulation of excessively susceptible minds. Nor, on the other hand, can we deny the reality of blindness for the visually impaired. Light is real for the sighted precisely because it is none other than the spark of vision itself, the birth of visual awareness as it opens up to the cosmos. And so the painter stands forever at that sliding moment, rather like riding the crest of a wave, at which the world is on the point of revealing itself, so that the perpetual birth of their awareness is concurrently the perpetual birth of the world. It's as though at every moment they were opening their eyes upon the world for the first time. And in this opening, the visual field, that is the night sky in its entirety, is merged with the field of their attention. And that's why the star, in our perception, sheds its light at once from the core of our being and from the furthest reaches of the cosmos. It simultaneously beams and beckons. And I'll henceforth refer to this conflation of beaming and beckoning, or of the affective and the cosmic, by means of the term atmosphere. Light, then, is neither physical nor psychic, it is atmospheric. And in his painting, Van Gogh has given us the atmosphere of the night sky, and I know no better rendering of it. Well, following our painterly contemplation of the night and a well-earned rest, we rise to discover that the sun is already up and is shining brightly in an azure sky. We daren't look at it directly. We know its form, however, to be that of a disk of brilliant yellow. For Gibson, as we've already noted, this form is delivered up to us by the sun's light. We see the form and not the light as such, registering the strain on our eyes as a kind of pain. And yet the sun doesn't just hang in the sky. It too both beams and beckons. To witness the sun is to see by its own light, or in the poetic language of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, if the eye were not sun-like, it could not see the sun. By sun-like, Goethe didn't mean to imply a relation of formal resemblance, as if to highlight the spherical form common to both suns and eyeballs. His point was rather that the same sun that shines in the sky, that is, the beacon, also shines from our eyes, that is, the beam. It's what we see with. So seeing with sunbeams is rather like feeling the wind. It's an affective mingling of our own awareness with the turbulence and pulsations of the medium in which we're immersed. After all, no more than the wind is the sun given to us as an object of perception. It rather gets inside us and saturates our consciousness to the extent that it is constitutive of our own capacity to see or feel. And in this vein, Merleau-Ponty described the relation of sunlight to vision as a kind of symbiosis, a way the outside has of invading us and our way of meeting this invasion. Those are his words. But where Merleau-Ponty wrote of symbiosis, I prefer the term correspondence. So to see the sun, as Goethe had insisted, the eyes must already respond to its light. But conversely, the sun can only shine in a world with eyes capable of so responding. So eyes and sun correspond. In his Bedeutungslehre, or Theory of Meaning of 1940, the Estonian-born biologist and founder of biosemiotics, Jakob von Uexküll, argued on these grounds that Goethe's insight was but half-formed. To complete it, one should add the corollary: if the sun were not eye-like, it could not shine in any sky. So von Uexküll's contention was that the sky, and the sun as a celestial light that illuminates the sky, can only exist in the phenomenal world of creatures with eyes. To be sure, were the sun to be conceived in a strictly physical sense, as an astronomical body rent by nuclear reactions, then it could perhaps be said to exist, even if there were no creatures to see it or in its light. And this, to recapitulate, was Gibson's argument, namely that light needs no eyes to exist, it only needs eyes to establish its relevance. But for von Uexküll, the sun in its shining was to be understood not as a physical entity, but as a manifest presence in the world of phenomena. And in this sense, just as the eye, as Goethe had observed, can see only by virtue of its correspondence with the sun, so the sun we perceive in the sky and that lights the world of our experience can exist only through its essential correspondence with the eye. So what then of the sky itself? Remember Gibson's observation that what he sees is the sky and not its luminosity, and yet that this sky, barring objects such as clouds that float in it or birds that fly in it, is pure emptiness. The sky presents a paradox for Gibson precisely because he can't countenance the environment in any other way than as a world of objects set over against the perceiver and revealed through the patterns of ambient light reflected from their opaque outer surfaces. But the sky has no surface. It's not a magically blue-painted dome that encompasses our lives within some giant bubble. To the contrary, it is openness or transparency itself. Nothing is there. So how can we see the sky when there is nothing to see? For Merleau-Ponty, by contrast, to see the sky just as to see the sun is precisely to experience its luminosity from within. To contemplate the blue of the sky, he writes, is not to be set over against it as an acosmic subject to cosmic object, nor is it to grasp it cognitively by assimilating the raw material of sensory experience to some abstract idea of blueness. It is rather to fuse the cosmic with the affective. I am the sky itself as it is drawn together and unified, writes Merleau-Ponty. My consciousness is saturated with this limitless blue. Maybe it sounds as though he'd be advertising for a cruise liner, but anyway, it sounds just a bit, my consciousness is saturated with this limitless blue. Or in a word, the blue sky is an atmosphere. And I mentioned earlier how seeing with sunbeams is like feeling the wind, and in a certain sense then, one breathes the light of the sky as one breathes the air, because when we breathe, it's not just the body that takes air in and lets it out, as though the mind could be left to float in the ether of the imagination. It is with our entire being, indissolubly body and soul, that we breathe. Or as Merleau-Ponty put it, there really is inspiration and expiration of being. And that's not to speak metaphorically. The words inspiration and expiration, Merleau-Ponty insisted, have to be taken quite literally. And in this double movement, he thought, lies the essence of perception. For in truth, the sky is not empty, save for birds and clouds, and celestial bodies such as the sun, the moon, and the stars. It is full of the material stuff of air. Long forgotten by thinkers whose overwhelming focus has been on the earthly grounding of dwelling and who speak of landscape in ways that exclude the atmosphere, and for whom the very idea of materiality conjures up images of solidity and the durability of forms, the air is the very medium that makes perception possible. Can man live elsewhere than in air? Asks the philosopher Luce Irigaray. And the question is, of course, a rhetorical one, to which the answer, as soon as it is posed, is obvious. Breathing the air, we also perceive in the air. It's not just that we would suffocate without it, we'd also be struck senseless. Normally, we can't see the air, though sometimes we can, as in the mist, or in the rising smoke from fires and chimneys, or in light snow when flakes in their feathery descent pick out the delicate tracery of aerial currents. And yet it's precisely because of the transparency of this life-sustaining medium that we can see. Moreover, in its vibrations, air transmits sound waves so that we can hear, and in the freedom of movement it affords, it allows us to touch. All perception, as Gibson realized, depends upon the air. In an airless, solidified world, perception would be impossible. And so our very existence as sentient beings is predicated on our immersion in the atmosphere. Now, in the phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty, to be sentient is to open up to a world, to yield to its embrace, and to resonate in one's inner being to its illuminations and reverberations. So to be able to see is to open to the experience of light. To be able to hear is to open to the experience of sound. To be able to touch is to open to the experience of feeling. Bathed in light, submerged in sound, and wrapped in feeling, the sentient being rides the crest of the world's becoming, ever present and witness to that moment when the world is about to disclose itself for what it is. So in a sentient world, there are no objects and subjects of perception. Rather, perception inheres in the creative movement of emergence, where things become things, to recall Merleau-Ponty's credo, and the world becomes world. So to perceive things is simultaneously to be perceived by them, to see is to be seen, to hear is to be heard, and so on. And this reversibility, most obvious in the exemplary instance of two hands touching, was for Merleau-Ponty fundamental to all perception, even to the perception of things we would normally consider inanimate. So in his work on landscape phenomenology, the archaeologist Chris Tilley reports that when he touches the stone of an ancient monument, he feels its touch on his hands. I touch the stone, and the stone touches me. Well, admittedly, the reversibility here is not quite of the same order as a handshake, because the stone in itself is not sentient. But this does not, in Tilley's view, invalidate his claim that he is indeed touched by the stone. Precisely because it affects him bodily and structures his awareness, the stone, he thinks, may be said to possess an agency of its own. Such things as stones, Tilley argues, are sensible without being sentient. And by this he means that they are as much part of the phenomenal world as are human bodies, and as such are already with perceivers, just as bodies are, in the very process of perception. Or they are, as Merleau-Ponty put it in posthumously published notes, of the same flesh. So the archaeologist doesn't just touch the stone, but touches with it. And in the idiom of Goethe and von Uexküll, the hand that touches the stone is already stone-like. Or otherwise put, stone is at once on both the hither and the far side of touch. And so it is too, says Merleau-Ponty, with the sun, the moon, and the stars. Eyes that know sunlight, moonlight, and starlight, like hands that know hardness and softness, roughness and smoothness, bring these qualities of light as of feeling into their own ways of perceiving. So when I touch, stone touches, because the texture of stone has already invaded my tactile awareness. When I look, the sun, the moon, and the stars look, since these celestial bodies in their luminosity have already invaded my visual awareness. And were I to listen, say, to a rumble of thunder that announces an impending storm, so the thunder listens because in its sonority, it would have already invaded my auditory awareness. So neither stone, nor sun, moon, and stars, nor thunder are in themselves sentient. But immersed in sentience, they can, as it were, double back so as to touch, see, and hear themselves. So the stone touches through hands that have become stone-like, the sun and the moon look through eyes that have become sun-like and moon-like, and the stars through eyes that are starstruck. Likewise, the thunder listens through thunderstruck ears. Every perception of the world, in short, is part and parcel of the world's perceiving itself. And in this coiling over, as Merleau-Ponty calls it, perceivers become one with what they perceive. But in Merleau-Ponty's key concept of the flesh, there remains a fundamental ambiguity. It clearly troubled him that the way in which the world penetrates the awareness of perceivers is not in reality the exact reverse of the way perceivers perceive the world. For a self-sensing being like a human, for one hand to touch another is precisely for the latter to touch the former. It doesn't make them touch this hand with this one, which it doesn't make any difference. But the flesh of the world, Merleau-Ponty admitted, is not self-sensing. It is sensible and not sentient. I call it flesh nonetheless, he wrote in notes to himself. So under this one concept are subsumed, on the one hand, my being with stone, star, or thunder, and the stones, the stars, or the thunders being with me. Now, that second kind of being with, we could say, is passionate. It's an inhalation of being, an invasion of consciousness. But the first is expressed in activity, in a moment of perception, launched on the current of exhalation. So the one gathers and draws in the medium in which I'm immersed, holding it in tension. The other releases the tension in bursting forth like a spark along a line of flight. And I think somehow the rhythmic alternation entailed here is comparable to that of the breaststroke in swimming, where the backward sweep of the arms and infolding of the legs is followed by a forward thrust. So this is a movement of gathering and recollection, that a movement of propulsion, and you're getting the rhythmic thing. And you can only keep going because of the alternation of that gathering in and then pushing out, right? Breathing in and breathing out. And with this, we can return to what I've called the fission-fusion reaction that drives all perception. In fusion, the stone, the star, or the thunder is with me. It's in my hands, my eyes and ears. But in fission, I have escaped from myself and am abroad in the cosmos, in among the elements. I am with them. So the next step in the argument is to assimilate this alternation between fusion and fission, or breathing in and out, to one between color and line. You cannot draw the sky, but you can paint it. Well, that at least was Gibson's opinion. Drawings are comprised of lines, and these lines, according to Gibson, delineate features of the environment that have come to the notice of the draftsman and that he wishes to commit to a surface. And these features are registered at the eye as the nested series of solid angles, which Gibson calls the optic array. What is not specified in the array, he says, cannot be drawn. So a line drawing could specify corners, edges, occluding edges, such as an upright cylindrical object like a tree trunk or a pylon. You draw a tree trunk as two parallel lines. The lines are not edges on the tree trunk, but they are occluding edges because they cut off the light at that point. So you can also draw wires, cracks or fissures, and the horizon that marks the division between earth and sky. But the drawing cannot specify shading, texture, or crucially the color of a surface. Only an abrupt discontinuity in any of these qualities, says Gibson, can be drawn. Moreover, in the absence of surface, you cannot draw translucence. That's why one might draw objects in the sky, such as clouds or the moon, whose outlines are specified by the angles they subtend at the eye. One cannot draw the sky itself, whether by day or by night. Now, although Gibson is adamant in his rejection of the more traditional view of drawing tied to classical optics, according to which the draftsman mentally projects onto the page an image that has first been formed in his mind and then physically traces the outlines, the pencil point of lead on the page still serves for Gibson as an inverse of the pencil point of light rays at the eye. So the line traced by the moving hand emerges as a record of the invariance extracted from the optical array by the moving eye. And to that extent, Gibson remains very much a Cartesian. Indeed, Descartes himself preferred copper engravings to paintings, a preference that Merleau-Ponty traces to the premise that in presenting things by their outsides, their envelopes, engravings preserve the forms of objects. That is, they record invariance in just the way that Gibson says drawings ought to do. So seeing and drawing, thus understood, both participate in what Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari call the white wall black hole system. Here, the black hole marks the site of subjectivity, the white wall, the plane of significance. Concealed behind or within the black hole and behind the pupil of the eye, there is the Cartesian intellect, isolated and self-contained. On the white wall are projected its constructions, whether rendered in writing or as drawn designs. In seeing, white light reflected from the surfaces of objects in the world converges at the black pupil of the eye, and in drawing, the typically black line issuing from the mind of the hidden subject by way of the hand is inscribed upon the white surface of paper. Color in this black hole white wall system is superficial, even deceptive. In contrast with the power of the line, whether engraved or drawn to specify invariant form, color figures as mere ornament, embellishment, or makeup, with the power to seduce or charm, but not, as in writing or drawing, to convey the processes of thought. Truth, writes the anthropologist Michael Taussig, truth comes in black and white for our philosophers. Shapes and forms, outlines and marks, that is truth. Color is another world, a luxury, an excess, a filler, a decoration. We have to fence it in with lines and marks, or what Taussig here calls the boundary riders of thought. But if we return to Van Gogh's Starry Night, then this division between line and color seems to be confounded. Because here, as Merleau-Ponty remarks, depth, color, form, line, movement, contour, physiognomy are all branches of being, and each one can sway all the rest. Because although this is a painting composed entirely of lines, you see every line is colored. They don't present themselves then as answering to line and color don't present themselves as answering to distinct problems or objectives, as between, say, recording information on the one hand and conveying mood on the other. Nor do they stand on the opposite sides of a division between a rational mind and an inchoate world, or between thought and feeling. Now, ever since Newton, we have been accustomed to the idea that as radiant energy, light comes in a range of wavelengths, which, if differentially refracted by means of a prism, yield up all the colors of the spectrum. Recombined, they merge into colorless white. And so color, for Newton, is equivalent to spectral differentiation. But if, as I've tried to argue here, waves of radiant energy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the capacity of photoreceptors in the eye to react to them, are conditions for the experience of light, but do not amount to light as such, then we have to ask again, well, what is color? Can we describe colors as differentiations not of wavelength, but of affect? Now, this, of course, is an old problem, and it lay at the root of Goethe's celebrated spat with Newton in his theory of colors of 1810. Color for Goethe is not a physical datum, but a phenomenon of correspondence, and every color is a particular blend of the affective and the cosmic. At its most concentrated, color is black. Light, at its most intense, is white. Thus, light dilutes color, and color dims light. White that becomes darkened or dimmed, Goethe observes, inclines to yellow. Black, as it becomes lighter, inclines to blue. So we have a gradation from black through blue, through yellow to white. And we can see that in Van Gogh's painting, where the brightest star nearest the horizon glows white, while those towards the zenith, as well as the moon, are fading to yellow. At the same time, the glimmerings of light in the night sky take it from black to shades of blue. So in this scheme, colors are not variations of radiant light spectrally arrayed on the white wall of projection as viewed through the black pinhole of the eye's pupil. For Van Gogh, as for Goethe, the black hole is a place not of emptiness, but of infinite density from which colors explode in the ignition of our visual awareness. So it follows then that all color, including that of the sky and the celestial bodies, is the product of a fission-fusion reaction. As against the Cartesian position, according to which the interior subject, at one with itself but divided from the cosmos, projects its meanings upon the white wall of the exterior, the seer, as in Merleau-Ponty's characterization, is inwardly at one with the cosmos, but divided from himself. There is no black and white opposition then between line and color, as though the pupillary movement of a black point issuing from within were traced upon the external surface already saturated with the constituent hues of white light. Rather, every line has, or better, is color, and every color goes out along a line. Whether painted, drawn, or written, lines pour from the fusion of the affective and the cosmic as colors pour from tar. Color walks, writes Tausig, and as it walks, so it changes. It's not therefore a mere adornment, conferring an outer garb to thought or filling its forms, but the very medium in which thought occurs. Just like the atmosphere, in the inclusive sense that I've delineated here, color gets inside us and makes it so that whatever we do, say, draw, or write is done with a certain affection or disposition. We inhale it as we breathe the air, and on the outward breath of exhalation, we weave our lines of speech, song, story, and handwriting into the fabric of the world. And so color lends atmosphere to the line, line gives color to the atmosphere. I think their relation is as intimate as in music between harmony and melody. And this was an analogy explicitly drawn by von Uexküll when he compared the life of every creature to a musical line and correspondent lifelines to a polyphonic score. So color and line are as closely related as vertical and horizontal readings of the score. So to sum up, as the atmospheric product of a fission-fusion reaction, light obeys very different rules from those to which we are accustomed from the science of optics. For one thing, as we've seen, it does not travel in straight lines as rays, but curls like the sparks of a fire or its wreaths of smoke. For another thing, it is neither emitted from a celestial source, nor registered by receptors in the eye, but follows the temporal correspondence of the seer's attention as it roams the heavens. It is in these respects comparable to sound, as it is to the wind. For is it not the sound of music that we hear when we listen to a melody? Perversely, the acoustician would insist that we do not. Sound, in his understanding, travels in a virtually straight line from source to recipient by way of vibrations in the medium. To suppose that we hear sound on listening to music, he would say, is as illusory as supposing that we see light on watching the flickering of a candle flame or when gazing at the twinkling stars. As light delivers the star or the candle as an object of perception, so sound delivers music, understood in the words of musicologist Eric Clark as a pattern of temporal proportions and pitch intervals. So the musical line goes one way and the line of sound goes another. The two lines exist in wholly different dimensions, as pattern differs from the vectors of projection by which it is rendered or discerned. It's as though music were drawn in black and white, which is, of course, exactly how it appears in standard musical notation, where black dots and lines are arranged in complicated patterns on white paper. And yet the musician will rightly protest. For her, in performance, the melodic line she plays with her instrument is a line of sound. And moreover, it's a line that is colored with intensities along a range from pitch black silence to white noise. Now, this musical understanding of sound is precisely equivalent to the understanding of light that I've proposed here, and it suggests, as the musicologist Victor Suckerkantel once observed, that in opening our eyes and ears to the sky, vision and hearing effectively become one. And they merge with feeling too, as we bear ourselves to the wind, because the wind too twists and turns, forming swirls and eddies. It may come from this or that direction, but the direction is not a point of origin, nor do I receive the wind like a tap on my cheek. Rather, the wind brushes by me on its journey to nowhere, and I feel it as I do my own body in its posture and movement. So, to return to the questions with which I began, what is a sunbeam? It is, I think, the visual equivalent of a peal of sound, as when we hear the toll of a bell ringing in our ears, or a gust of wind as we feel it wrapping around our bodies. Why do stars seem so remote and so close at the same time? Because their light is generated in a reaction of fission and fusion. Can you paint the sky or draw it? Well, these are not alternatives, as the example of Van Gogh's painting shows, for he paints with line, and the line is colored. What do we mean when we say we see the sky? That we are present in the moment-by-moment birth of the atmosphere. And then finally, what is the sky? Well, I hesitate to give a final answer, because that would bring a kind of closure to what, more than anything, reveals the fundamental openness of the world in which we live. The sky, perhaps, is the kingdom of light, sound, and air. It might perhaps be defined by a simple experiment, which you can all do if you like. Place one finger between your eyes and touch the hard surface of your forehead, just like that, right? I can't do it with my glasses on. Take them off. Put them like that. Reassure yourself when you touch your finger that, yeah, you're still there, right? You're definitely there. And yet, in the visual field, this tapping finger strikes no surface, but rather looms as a ghostly presence that casts its shadow in the void. What's it doing there, getting in the way? It's not, it sort of comes in from nowhere. So we are at once at home in our bodies and inhabitants of a world in which the body returns to us as a spectre. And that world is the sky. So to conclude, let me return to Merleau-Ponty's notion of the flesh. Recall that even in his last writings, Merleau-Ponty remained confused about whether we are of the flesh of the world because of the way it is with us, or because of the way we are with it? Does he mean the fusion of affect with the cosmos, to which I've referring to the interlacing lines of flight or fission along which our own and others' lives are stretched? Now, elsewhere, I've called this interlacing of lines the meshwork. So we can rephrase the question as follows: is the flesh meshwork or atmosphere? And my answer is that it is not one or the other, but alternately both. Atmosphere on the inhalation, meshwork on the exhalation. Meshwork and atmosphere are, if you will, two sides of the flesh corresponding to the two senses of being with that I've just distinguished. And the living, respiring being is the site where atmospheric immersion is transformed into the growth of the meshwork along its proliferating lines. In flight, the bird draws the sky, but gathers the atmosphere into its wings. When Van Gogh paints, he gathers the color of the night, the colors of the night into his brush, and goes on to weave his way around and between the stars. The magic of flight and of painting is, of course, epitomized in the famous story of Aladdin and the lamp. With a gentle stroke of wing or brush, as Aladdin stroked the lamp, whole worlds are unloosed of vast horizons and empty skies of immense possibilities. All it takes is a soft touch, a little gesture, manual or visual, to rekindle the genie and release an atmosphere. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tim. My name is Sarah Perry. I'm a lecturer in cultural heritage management here in the Department of Archaeology, and I have the great pleasure of chairing the question period for Tim. I think kind of like with Jason's introduction, Tim's work has been very formative for me, and I can still remember distinctly many years ago when I was an undergraduate student being introduced to his Temporality of the Landscape paper from 1993, which at that point changed who I was as a scholar and as a person, and really provided a kind of moment of liberation from the kind of education that I was getting at that time to something that has inspired me ever since. And so in that way, I was quite struck by your point at the beginning with respect to Gibson and Merleau-Ponty's work, one being piercing and one that's something that stays with you. And certainly your work has been both for me, and I continue to look forward to it as it comes out. So with that said, I look forward to hearing what has been provoked in all of you via the lecture, and would like to open the floor up to questions. Yes.
I have a question for you about effect, which was very interesting, but in some ways mobilized by what you were describing as line and color, and also in some way is an effect of color.
Effect.
Yes, an effect. Exactly. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, please, without more sharply, the relations that you see there and the degree to which you think of affect as an effect.
Not in a straightforward sort of cause-effect relationship, as though you say, here's the cause and it's produced this effect, but in a sense that but maybe a musical analogy helps. I mean, when you hear music, say a song or something being played, you respond to it in an affective way. So that I'm thinking of, not in terms of instead of the standard linear sort of cause-effect relationship, I get back to this notion of correspondence, which is very central. I've found it to be very central to what I want to say. And by correspondence, I'm thinking, for example, of lines of musical counterpoint, where each, or perhaps in polyphony, in choral polyphony, where each of the lines is, so to speak, continually answering to each and every other, and that's a movement that is carrying on through time. And I would think of an affective movement as something of that kind, so that one of Van Gogh's coloured lines there is itself a line of affect, and it moves and corresponds with the other lines. That's the way I'm trying to think about it. There's an awful lot of writing about affect now, and it's all over the place, and I'm not entirely on top of the literature myself, and I think it's probably being used in a multitude of different ways, which will need some sorting out, and I've far from done that. But this is all mixed up with an attempt to try and make sense of the concept of atmosphere, which has also suddenly exploded, particularly in human geography and also in aesthetics, and to try and bring together what seem to be two quite separate literatures, a literature which simply talks about atmosphere in terms of affect and mood, and a literature that talks about it in terms of air movements and even climate and even a meteorological way. And I want to try and bring those together, and that's partly behind this attempt to say that, well, if we're talking about atmosphere, it's something which brings the cosmic and the affective into some sort of relationship. Does that help? Sort of. I mean, it's not all clear yet.
So it's a very, very kind phrase, but I was really struck by some of what you were talking about with the kind of resonances it had with some of the work I'm doing, where I'm looking at 16th and 17th century ideas about materiality. So this idea that you touch a stone and become stony in some ways, you know, it has that resonance. It made me think about some of your other work and the way in which you have looked anthropologically to kind of see where some of the ideas that here you're thinking through Van Gogh and Merleau-Ponty and Gibson to kind of get to these places. But I suppose so, such as it is the question in a sense is, again, is part of this project, or is there an element where you see in kind of some of the anthropological work, but there are cultures where something of what you're describing?
I mean, one beautiful example of this, which I didn't refer to here but have done elsewhere, is it's now become a classic book by the anthropologist Julie Cruikshank, working amongst Tlingit people. That's the First Nations people who inhabit the sort of panhandle of Alaska, where it just goes down into British Columbia, and very, very mountainous area with some of the most active glaciers in the world. And Julie's book is called Do Glaciers Listen? And the thing is that the Tlingit people say that they do. And because they listen, you have to behave carefully in the vicinity of a glacier, because if you offend it, it could surge. And there have historically been surges. They're recorded in oral tradition, and whole communities can be wiped out if the glacier suddenly moves. And so the really interesting question is there: what on earth do they mean if they say glaciers listen? And I think the answer is this: that they're not so stupid as to think that glaciers have ears, or that they possess a nervous system or something like that. But what they mean is that, I mean, unlike those, say, a geologist whom the glacier is sort of object of investigation, if you're actually living in or on the glacier, if it's part of your life involves traversing it, sometimes going underneath it, you know, in the sort of underground waterways, then that glacier takes you over. You're dazzled by the light because it's very white. You're also sort of taken over by the sound because there's a lot of cracking, very, very loud cracking noise. And there's also this dampness that you feel, which really gets inside you. It's just like we'd say sort of colloquially, you know, you feel it under your skin, that the feeling, the light, the sound gets so much inside you that you are seeing, listening, feeling through it. And I think that's what saying that the glacier listens, that's what it means. It means that it's listening through you, the person on it. So that's an anthropological example of the same thing working out, a particularly beautiful one, but I think you could find plenty more examples of that kind in the literature. Yeah. Say it again. I got lost.
I wonder if the light only delivers the object we see our kind of controversy with the Timber effect.
With the what effect? Sorry. Tynda. What is the Tyndall effect? Ah, sorry, the Tyndall effect. So, and explain what that means then, the Tyndall effect. Or can somebody else explain it? So the,
We can't see the light. Why we see kind of little particles
in the light. Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with what Gibson is saying there, but his point is that he wants to say that what we see are objects in the environment, and that there is I mean, it's strange because when we're talking about hearing, for example, say we hear sounds, but whenever we talk about vision, we say, oh, we see objects or stuff. We hear sounds rather than objects, but we see objects rather than light. So there's some kind of curious asymmetry built into all of these arguments. And you know, there'd be the question of whether we might perhaps see with the light, we see particles in the air, and perhaps or whatever we might see, a bit smoke and all sorts of things. But that's just why it leads us to in my mind anyway, it leads us to a very curious, to insist and that you can't see light, you only see objects in the light. Then it leads one to continually to have to narrow down what light is or what light could be, until eventually it just becomes an energetic impulse in the physicalist description of it, which, like, yes, you don't need any eyes for that light. If that's all light is, then, you know, it's all right. If somebody in optics or physics wants to define light in that way, then fine. But it's not going to tell us anything much about the nature of visual experience. And that's, I don't know whether that answers the question, but that's the problem with it. Sorry if I wasn't clear. Yeah.
Hi. So I've been working on my theory chapter for my PhD, and I'm looking at probably you're aware of this dichotomy between the conversations of tangible heritage and intangible heritage.
Oh,
sort of that polarized thing. So I'm trying to jump into that and complicate things a bit. And I've sort of been thinking about it in terms of different kind of worlds or states of being, something like that. But hearing you talk today has brought into mind this concept of focus. And I wondered if maybe the way that you're looking at the painting and some of the lines, it's, you know, focusing on specific things, and how do we understand our focus is my question.
Well, maybe part of the answer would be if you're talking about Van Gogh. I mean, this was his, I think, if I put it right, his second attempt to draw a starry sky. And a year or so earlier, he'd drawn and painted another picture that is not quite so celebrated, where he'd bowed to convention, so to speak, and painted the stars like little yellow dots with rays coming out from the center, right? Like we often in children's books, you depict the sun as this disk, and then lines coming out from as though they were radiating like spokes of a wheel out from the center. And then when he did this, he abandoned that, and the lines go round like this. And I think this is really a significant sort of transition. And and there's some correspondence that I found reading up about this, about Van Gogh actually explaining what he wanted to do. And he said that he was really emphasizing this sense that he wanted to get a sense of what it feels to be looking at the sky over a period of time. That he says it's not the kind of thing that you would get just by a snapshot. And maybe the snapshot would have the lines coming out like this. But if you want to paint the process of seeing, then the lines go like that.
That's what those photographs look like when you take an overexposed photograph.
Indeed, they do, yes. And there's also work suggesting that around that time, there's a beautiful book by I've forgotten his name now, but a guy from Oxford who wrote a book about the history of drawings of the nebulae. When people started in the 19th century looking at nebulae through telescopes and drawing what they saw. And Van Gogh would have been familiar with these drawings. And they were also being drawn in this sort of spiral form. And the question was, what were these spirals actually, and what were they? So I don't know whether that relates to your issue about focus, but the key thing about it, I think, is that, and it's also the point that Gibson is making, which I kind of agree with, that we've got to think about vision as something that happens along a path, along a line of movement, and not something that is as though here we are, there's the sky, now we're a relationship between us and it, because we're moving along in time, the sky's moving along in time, and we want to, and the experience lies in the correspondence of those movements, not in a line that might connect us here and the world there, as in, say, perspective painting, where we've got to be at one particular point in order to get the view that you do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Any other queries? Yes.
I'm not sure if this is going to come out clearly, but I'd like to sort of, if you could say a bit more about what led you to the use of Van Gogh and this particular image as a way of exemplifying and also, shall we say, giving weight to your broader arguments. Because one of the things I was sort of wondering is if one's thinking about how, for instance, colour of an image might suffuse one's visual field, I started thinking about the experience of standing in front of one of Yves Klein's blue paintings, which are absolutely not representational in the way that the paint is applied, aren't doing the, if you like, the stroke of the paint-loaded brush. And I also like if you could say something about the distinction between, shall we say, the line and the stroke. But something like Klein, which is at one level presenting a particular proposition, as I understand it, about, you know, the pictorial surface and the eye, and my experience is very, very, very strange things to you. And I was wondering, that seems to be, in a kind of broader way, a particular colour producing an atmosphere. It's a ramble, not a question.
But it's a very interesting ramble. I mean, the bare fact of the matter is, as I'm trying to remember now what happened, but I was starting to write this stuff about. I wanted to address this issue about what light is and the relation between line and color, and I actually started thinking about this difference between, I just mentioned, between the things radiating out and the spiral, and I suddenly looked on my study wall, on which I happen to have a reproduction of this painting because I like it. I got it there some years ago. I think I was at MoMA, where it hangs at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and I think I bought the reproduction because I liked it and took it home and put it in a frame, and it was hanging on my wall. And I was just in the middle of trying to see how on earth can I proceed with this, and then I looked up and there it was, and I thought, and actually it saved the day, because Otherwise, I didn't know where I was going, and it suddenly gave me something I could talk about. I say, there it is. Now we could think with this painting, and suddenly a whole lot of things fell into place, and I decided I liked the painting more and more. So that's what happened. On the question of the relationship between line and stroke is really, really interesting, because the stroke I take to be a gesture, as a movement of. So you've got your paint on the brush, you move the brush in whichever way. So there are all these strokes that Van Gogh must have made to paint this picture, and you can more or less see what they would have been. Most of them are quite interestingly quite short strokes. Other painters would have done perhaps longer ones, but the line then is the trace of a gesture. It's the trace of a movement, and that is what is kind of interesting for me about line, the way in which it registers a stroke or a movement in that case. And for me, that, I think for anybody else, I mean, this painting is absolutely full of movement. You look at it and after a while you start feeling a bit giddy, as indeed you do if you're standing under the stars and looking up. You also begin to feel a bit giddy after a while. So that's that. I don't know, Klein, I hadn't thought of drawing a comparison there. Because usually, I'm not sure whether it happened in this case. I mean, often Van Gogh did sketches first with a pencil or whatever he used, and then did the painting. So he would have first of all done the lines. In this painting, I don't think he did, or at least I don't think we have any sketch record of it. I'm not 100% sure about that. So he might have drawn it first and then painted, but I'm not sure, and it's hard to say what his process was exactly. But in correspondence to a friend that I read in another publication, he was very clear about how he wanted to get at a deeper sense of the world by getting into its processes, so to get away from and it's the same sort of thing that he would expect you to stand for some time in front of this and maybe move around. I don't know. That's a rambling answer too. Sorry.
One last question.
Yeah. You talk about sight and sound and touch, and there's no smell or taste in there. I find that I come across this kind of dropping of them
very often, yes.
Quite often, and I wonder why, because you mentioned inhaling, so both taste and smell sound like very internalized.
Smell particularly. Yeah, I think, I kind of haven't really got a handle on taste and smell. Maybe it's just that it just gets too complicated. But I was thinking about it not long ago. There's this interesting difference between with smelling, with sniffing, and just sort of taking in the general ambient smell of a place. Like so the sniff is almost like the propulsive movement of the vest stroke. You can imagine a mouse you're going. He's taking little inputs. It's actually the air's going in, but it's rather like actually going out. And I think, and then you can imagine the simple sort of a relaxed breathing in by which you inhale an atmosphere. So there's some sort of difference, isn't there, between the inhalation of the atmosphere and the exploratory sniffing by which you might try to follow a trail, as a dog might do, looking around. And I came to think about that and was sort of kicking myself for not having brought it in somehow or other. But I should, obviously, it should come in somewhere, because it's actually really interesting. And these short things. I mean, it's like if you're sawing a plank of wood. The first thing you have to do is to get the groove going, and you often but lots of sort of quite short backstrokes, and then you get into the rhythm. It's the same thing. So I think there's something to do there. Yeah. Taste, I don't know, except that we had a great seminar, a professor of gastronomic philosophy from Italy giving us a seminar in Aberdeen not long ago, and he was talking about wine tasting and making the distinction between the wine tasters who have a sniff and take a little mouthful, swish it around, and then spit it out, and the good citizen who has a nice glass and lets it soak through, and how different that is. He was linking that to the difference between the optical and the haptic. That there's this wine tasting, you really keep your distance. You don't let it go any further down than the mouth, and the actual taking in. It's a rather similar thing, I think.
Perfect question to end on, I think, because it anticipates what might come next. Thank you all for joining us. You can tune into the U of Y Archaeology YouTube page if you want to catch the lecture again. But of course, thanks especially to Tim Ingold for an incredible talk, and I think we'll all look forward to seeing how the research evolves. Thank you so much.
We invite you all to drink from the factory.
Sorry. Should be later. Yeah, the most important part. Yeah.